This is the fourth and final webinar in our four-part series with editors and contributors to the new volume, American Revolutions in the Digital Age, published by Cornell Press in 2024. And you can find a link to the text, which is available open access online in the chat. Thank you, Perry. My name's Jessica Dotrieve, and I'm one of your co-hosts for the session today, along with my colleague, Perry Meldon. I helped to organize this session as the digital humanities consultant for the ACE Mellon Humanities Postdoctoral Fellowship Program, and we have some of our fellows in attendance today. We're glad to see you all here. To learn more about this program, you can visit the website that is linked in the chat. And I also want to thank the Living Landscape Observer, which is a newsletter and website, for helping to support this event as well. And you can also find a link to Living Landscape Observer and the whole series of these American Revolutions and the Digital Age webinar in the chat as well. So I just want to begin today with a few notes about the structure of the webinar. First, we wanted to let everybody know this will be recorded. Although audience members will remain off mic and off camera, by staying in the webinar, you are giving permission for comments and questions to be recorded when we get towards the end of the session today. Closed captioning is also available during this session. To turn these on or off, you can click on the icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen that reads Show Captions, and you should see those there. If anyone has issues accessing that, you can please let us know in the chat or the Q&A. So our session today will run for 1 hour. The first 30 to 40 minutes will feature discussion between our moderator and panelists, who Perry will introduce in just a moment. And then around 3:30, 3:40, we'll open it up to your questions and comments. So if you'd like to pose a question for our presenters to discuss, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen during any point at the event, and we will get to those towards the end of the session. You can also use the chat function to communicate with the panelists and each other in a more informal way throughout the session. To do so, now that the chat is enabled, you can click the chat icon at the bottom of the screen that looks like 2 speech bubbles. And to make sure that your comments are visible to everyone instead of just the 5 of us, be sure to set your messages to panelists and attendees. And we do encourage everyone to actively participate today through the chat and the Q&A function, but do ask that you keep your questions and your comments respectful and on topic for today. And so with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Perry Meldon, to introduce the session and our invited panelists. Thanks, Perry.
Thank you, Jessica. As Jessica mentioned, my name is Perry Meldon, and along with my colleague, Dr. Eleanor Mahoney, we coordinate the ACE Mellon Humanities Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for today's session, Information Technology and Lessons from the American Revolution. Our moderator is Dr. Nora Slonimsky. Dr. Slonimsky is an associate professor and chair of the Department of History at Iona University, where she is also the director of the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies. She's the author of the forthcoming book, The Engine of Free Expression, Copywriting the State in Early America, and co-editor of American Revolutions in the Digital Age. She's joined by Dr. Jordan Taylor, who is a historian working as manager of digital content for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. He is the author of Misinformation Nation, Foreign News and the Politics of Truth in Revolutionary America. His current book project, tentatively titled Democracy's Dark Arts, America's Founders and the Problem of Truth, explores how the revolutionary generation grappled with the challenge of misinformation in a Republican government. We are also joined by Dr. Joseph M. Adelman, who is the 2025-2026 Visiting Senior Fellow at the John Nicholas Brown Center at Brown University and Professor of History at Framingham State University. A historian of media, communications, and politics in early America, he is the author of Revolutionary Networks, The Business and Politics of Printing the News, 1763 to 1789. Dr. Adelman is now at work on a history of the Post Office of America, in America. Before diving into this conversation, I'd like to offer a brief overview of the 2 chapters that our presenters authored for the book, American Revolutions in the Digital Age. Dr. Taylor's essay, Media Literacy in Revolutionary America, reflects on the democratization of information during the 18th century and how institutions like the press, post office, and schools enabled ordinary colonists to become well-informed or poorly informed, depending on whom you ask, about transatlantic matters. Yet the widespread distribution of knowledge also led to circulation of false information in ways that invite comparisons to present-day conflicts around fake news available at our fingertips. In his essay, A Busy, Bustling, Disputatious Tone, News Anxiety in the Age of Revolutions and Today, Dr. Adelman raises similar questions about the rapid pace of news distribution across both the 18th and 21st centuries. He explores the echoes of anxiety and overwhelm shared across centuries, rooted in the mismanagement of information. Exploring communications infrastructure, the flow of news, and the analog and digital tools available, Dr. Adelman aims to quell some of our anxieties through offering lessons from the past. Both essays identify parallels between our current moment and the revolutionary era, bringing important questions for historians: how we distinguish fact from interpretation amid the constant onslaught of news. Before I turn it over to Dr. Slonimsky, I'll say that as a relative Luddite and a 20th century historian, I was not sure what to expect from a session about information technology, but I can promise you this is not your average IT call. And with that, I will turn it over to Nora.
All right. Okay, great. I struggled apparently to unmute myself. How many years of working with Zoom, and yet that still happens. Thank you so much, Perry. And that's actually a really wonderful pivot, which I will get to in just a moment, about not just your typical IT call. But I did want to take a moment before we get started and thank you all so much for being here. Also, thank you to Landscape Observer, the Mellon Foundation, and of course, Jessica, Perry, and Eleanor for making this series possible. It's been really wonderful to hear my colleagues and other contributors to the volume, and also hear the wonderful feedback and insights from everybody who's attended these sessions. So it's a little bittersweet that this is the last one, but if you haven't gotten a chance to check out the volume yet, and why would you necessarily, although I hope you do shortly hereafter if you haven't already, the section that we're talking about today is titled Echoes of the Present. So it's a very deliberate, very specifically targeted conversation about how technologies of communications of the past and the way those form expression and ideas and information as distinct from knowledge, right, as Jordan really eloquently points out in his essay, as having these sort of strong parallels to the present, yet also operating in their own distinct moment in time and place. So you could say that our conversation today is really a bird's eye view of election. It allows us to zoom out and think about how the technologies and tools that we use to study the past, the revolution and the revolutionary era, but not even just that moment, right? Really across time and space, really show how complicated the role of media and communications are in historical phenomenon, and for our purposes, the origins, war for, and aftermath of independence, which is a very layered process because we are learning about that through modern day tools. So in other words, the driving question of this section of the volume is, how does a better understanding of the relationship between media and revolution in the past help us to understand the relationship between media and revolution in the present? And I think that is a thread throughout the volume, but it's one that Joe and Jordan really focus on quite specifically in their contributions. And I should also say as a sidebar that I have long admired Joe and Jordan's work very, very much and learned a lot from it. And these are basically the essays that I've always wanted to read from them. So it was really just very wonderful getting to see that happen in real time. So my first question for you both is, what parallels do you see with the media, both social and maybe not so social, of the past, between that specifically of the revolutionary era and our present day?
Well, thank you. And thank you to, I'll go first if that's okay, Joe. You can go first next time. Um, First of all, thanks to everyone for coming here. Thanks to Jessica and Perry and Nora. Um, and what a big question, you know? Um, it's one of those questions that I feel like I've been working on for about 15 years and I'm still starting to figure out. It changes every day. Um, when I think about parallels between the media environment of revolutionary America and today, I think about the promise of liberation that's sort of grafted onto the newspaper in much of the 18th century. A lot of people don't like newspapers. But newspaper printers, political dissidents make the case that newspapers are opening up knowledge for a broader population and that this was socially useful. Um, and, at its most noble, that newspapers could even become a bulwark against tyranny. Um, they are pretty effective at building up hype for this new information technology. And then predictably enough, there's a backlash, right? By the 1790s, especially, a lot of Americans are starting to realize that newspapers uh, aren't doing what they hoped they would do, right? They're misinforming people. They're worried that a lot of the dysfunction in their political world is due to newspapers. I always like the example of Thomas Jefferson. He's so often a great example because you can find an example of him taking any kind of position on anything. But he in 1787 makes this, I think, kind of bonkers claim about newspapers. He says that if it were left to me, he would rather have a government. I'm sorry, he would rather have a world with newspapers and no government rather than a world with government and no newspapers. And then about almost exactly 20 years later, while he's at the end of his presidency, he gets a letter from this young man who's trying to become a newspaper printer. He's looking for advice from the president, and because this is 1807, the president just answers, which is something I wish we still had. Um, and he says you shouldn't do this. Newspapers are awful. He says that because of the press's abandoned prostitution to falsehood, nothing can now be believed, which is seen in a newspaper. So there's this incredibly rapid turnaround. This medium is not operating as it's supposed to. And I think for social media, we're in a similar moment. For a lot of our digital tools that we rely on, we're in a similar moment. It wasn't that long ago, 15 years ago, the Arab Spring, Twitter was viewed as this incredible tool of social liberation. And then there's subsequently been a backlash against it. I think we're in a similar moment potentially with AI, LLMs, where people are making all kinds of promises. Today we're gathered on it's actually a historic day. I'm not sure if all of us are aware. This is a historic day. It's the launch of the Death Star, GPT-5, which is coming to destroy everyone's jobs. So this is a day we'll long remember. And I think really what's happening is there's a lot of expectation. There are promises of liberation. We're still, there's plenty of backlash, there's plenty of critical commentary, but we're still very much in sort of a techno optimist, if not techno utopian stage for artificial intelligence. So I think this promise of liberation and almost cyclical tendency toward backlash is something that is potentially useful for understanding our moment. Other things as well, there's this effort to grapple with an explosion of information. There is this fear that partisanship is being stoked by increasingly disconnected information environments. That's something that I doubt anyone is going to contest in our present, but it's very clearly the case also in the 1770s and the 1790s. You see newspapers that are associated with a particular political cause are almost, we would say almost algorithmically dividing up the information that's being distributed. And what people are seeing is a reflection in a lot of ways of their own politics and their own aspirations. There's a sort of anti-institutionalism and anti-intellectualism probably that's related to this, the growing availability of information that's resulting from the newspaper can sort of lead to a rejection of authority as people have more access to information. They are less likely to defer to people who traditionally were gatekeepers or held access to those forms of information. And so there's a cultural shift that accompanies that. And then the last thing I think is that one other similarity between our moment and the revolutionary era is that there are all kinds of attempts to solve this problem, and none of them really work so far for our moment, right? There are people who propose the creation of new institutions, new newspapers, right? Which doesn't work because those are partisan newspapers for the most part. There are attempts to regulate the information environment, most famously under the Alien and Sedition Acts, but also under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. There are efforts to sustain institutions of education and knowledge production, but those don't really go anywhere for the most part because they don't want to pay taxes to support universities and public education. And as Perry mentioned in her description of my chapter, there are attempts at helping people learn how to navigate the emerging information environment, what we would today kind of think of as media literacy training. And that doesn't really work either because people's judgment turns out to be colored by their pre-existing perceptions so often. So there's a lot that is worth investigating, I think, further when we think about these parallels between the past and the present.
There's a lot, and yet I still have more to add. So well, first of all, I want to add my thanks to Perry and Jessica and Eleanor and Nora, and Mark and Ben. I know Mark is on the call somewhere, so I don't want to leave him out, for getting to be part of the volume and the conference that predated the volume and this conversation. So I basically agree with everything Jordan said. I want to highlight a couple of other things that sort of come from a different perspective, in thinking about similarities and maybe some differences at the same time. One is, I think, a sort of that I see as sort of a fragmentation of the media environment. In the 18th century, one of the differences I think that I would highlight is in the 18th century, that was sort of a status quo, that was sort of the existing structure, where what we have now, and I remember from rereading my essay that I mentioned this, that we're kind of headed back to that sort of decentralized, many more small players. There's sort of a devolution back to a fragmented media environment from something in the 1960s, 70s, 80s with network news, and then network news plus CNN, or right, with very few large corporations, which still exist, but that sense of fragmentation of the news is sort of there, as Jordan pointed out, from a partisan perspective, often in both the 18th and now, as a way of thinking about it. So that would be one place to pick up on, is that the environment is very fragmented and decentralized. Related to that, the second point I would make is the importance of thinking about networks and connections among media organizations of whatever size. So thinking about in the 18th century, the ways in which printers communicated with one another and newspaper editors, and circulated their stories, the ways in which they reflected the partisan makeup of themselves and their compatriots, and the reflection. I'm trying to present this in a politically neutral way, but thinking about the news ecosystem of there is a pathway for things, for example, in the right-wing media ecosphere to get to Fox News from some of these other kinds of news organizations, and they're connected into one another, that they're reading and thinking about the same kinds of sources. And so thinking about that as a similarity. Um, and then the third I'd add in, and this is something that it's one of my hobby horses when talking about news and newspapers, is for 3 centuries, there's been a basic assumption when you're reading the news by the publishers of the news that their audience read last week's issue, whatever that was, right? Last week's or yesterday's, and we find this. I mean, I remember back in the heyday of Twitter, if I was out with my family all day and signed on at like 8 o'clock on a Sunday night, there would be some conversation going on that was like a third tier derivative conversation about a conversation about a conversation of something somebody had raised as a substantive issue at like 9 o'clock that morning. And the assumption on Twitter back in 2015 or in Blue Sky today or Threads or whatever, or in the 18th century is that everybody was up to speed on what was going on. And so there's never really a moment, the way they conceive of their audience is very much as an audience that is both trying to be more informed, but is also already informed in certain ways. Um, and I know it's 15 to 20 years ago that Ezra Klein started Vox Media, which its original intent way back in the late aughts, I think, was to serve as this sort of people don't know the background. We're going to be the explainers and give you that background on what's happening in the news. You don't know what the Obamacare law act, the bill has in it, because the conversation is about trading for this or trading for that or this provision. Um, and so we're going to be that sort of model. And they kind of moved away from that and now are also in that, got sort of sucked back into that presumption. So I think peeling back that layer and thinking about the ways in which for the 18th century, you have to figure out the story by reading a lot of news and reading across things, that it's actually very difficult to get up to speed on an issue, to get briefed by reading any one thing.
Thank you both so much. So this, and I may change up sort of our run of show ever so slightly, because something that you and for anyone listening in, we will get to AI. That is sort of the elephant in the book, so to speak.
We don't have to.
Oh, I think as Jordan noted today, our inbox is all in a flurry. I think we will be getting to that. But something you both point to, I think really, and I think this is really significant, especially for our colleagues who are in any kind of public facing site, national park, historic site too, is essentially the fracture of these different media outlets, right? Like Joe, you just mentioned, Twitter, X, Threads, Instagram, like, right, there's all these different proliferation of platforms. And Jordan, you spoke to this too, right? There's so many different sort of places for when people are gaining or getting rather their information from, whether that information is correct or incorrect, right? That is where they are getting it from, is these different sources, or these different outlets, I should say, different mediums. How do you think digital tools from the digital humanities, more specifically, can help address that issue of fracture? In other words, as social media proliferates, there's all these different platforms. How can digital tools help us to kind of navigate them? How can it help us to maybe catch up on the background reading we didn't have in a similar way to the way newspapers did? And obviously media technology, to get back on track a bit, does function quite differently than that of the 18th century, right? The technology we're describing did not exist in that period. And yet, are there ways that digital tools can help with providing that background, with shaping that context, with maybe getting that information, so that siloing problem is not quite as challenging? Or maybe that's hopelessly naive. I leave it to you both to give me the answer, but I would love your thoughts.
Can I say that it's not hopeless, but it may be a little naive? So I think one of the things, I'm going to start with a challenge for answering the kind of question you asked in a hopeful way. And it's something I talk about in the essay for the book, is the issue of proprietary databases. And that's more true actually for the Revolutionary era than it is for later periods, simply because of the way in which online databases developed. So for the 19th century, and I think I saw in the latest round of NEH grants that there are still grants going to the National Digital Newspaper Program. So there are still newspaper issues being digitized for the Chronicling America program, which is a fantastic and amazing resource. And is not as strong for pre-1800 newspapers. And one of the very straightforward practical reasons for that is that Redex and the American Antiquarian Society in the 1950s created an amazing set of digital resources at the time that was digital as microfilm. Um, and then in the late 90s and early 2000s, created an online platform for that, but it's proprietary. And your access to that is contingent on your access to a major public library system like the Boston Public Library, or, I point out, I teach at a relatively small comprehensive state university where I twisted arms for a year and a half to get them to subscribe to a little bit of the newspaper databases so I could teach with them. But there's 14 series of the early American digital newspapers, and we have access to two. So, something as simple as search results on something like in the essay, I talk about common sense and mentions of Paine's pamphlet in the newspaper in 1776. Your search results are different if you do that through the Framingham State Network than if you do that at the Boston Public Library, than if you do it at Iona, than if you do it in the American Antiquarian Society, where because it's their contract, they have all the databases, right? Your answers are different based on which database you're using, and your answer would be different still if you're using Chronicling America, because not as many 1770s newspapers have made it into that particular database. Um, well, I guess I feel like I'm now pushing you back into the hopeless side of things. I guess the caution would be, starting from a caution, is know what database you're using, which I know is something that everybody on this call, I'm sure, knows already, but is just as a good reminder of thinking about the ways in which things are put together. Um, but from that, you can, I think, get to some ways of answering it. And I'm not sure whether you were asking the question as sort of practitioners working behind the scenes to be prepared to work with the public, or at the moment of engaging with the public, which I think is a more difficult, it's harder to get somebody to sort of pull out their phone and go into a database and search for something while they're in the middle of a tour at a national park site. Um, but we can think about, we can use these sources to create a basis for a conversation, um, to go in and look at and say, here is the variety of things that people said. Um, we're historians, so our favorite answer is it's complicated, right? So uh, disassociating people from their one received answer is in some ways, a successful interaction. But to be able to say about, the Jay Treaty in the 1790s, or I saw Susan Smith from the post office, so I'll go for the post office example. Right, the constitutional post office in 1774, 1775. You can't give the answer, but you can help people see, using those tools, getting into, because the great thing is before the 1950s and before the early 2000s, you had to get to Worcester to be able to read those newspapers. And now you don't. Right. So that's the flip side of my saying that access is contingent and differentiated, is there is access. There you can go into various spaces across the United States, and nobody has to mail microfilm or be in the physical reading room um, to be able to look at the physical copies, that you can go and say, okay, here's what was there, and start a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely everything Joe said. And I think Nora's query is an important one. We um, there are a lot of problems that come from using digital tools um, to read newspapers. Um, in some ways, the biggest danger is efficiency, I think. This is something that digital humanists have been pointing out for a long time. It's not my observation by any means, but the beautiful blessing of studying newspapers is the accessibility and efficiency of research in them if you have access to those tools. But keyword searching and dipping in and out of sources as those databases are set up, they're designed for that kind of work. They push you toward that. That can make it difficult to determine context, significance. As critics have pointed out, it makes it easier to avoid going to Worcester to the American Antiquarian Society to page through things slowly, luxuriously. You don't talk to archivists who know a lot more than historians in a lot of cases about a particular body of sources. And so there's a real loss that comes from that. For my book, I did rely on the database that Joe was talking about primarily, as you can imagine, because my book was trying to knit together these conversations that are happening across, you know, 3 continents in a century, essentially. So it was impossible to do anything but the most kind of efficient research that I could. But one of the things that I really enjoyed, and uh, much more than I probably should have, was the fact that there were certain newspapers that weren't digitized, right? So I had to go into microfilm versions of, especially Canadian newspapers. Canada needs to get on that, or maybe
And
they have by now.
and South Carolina.
Yeah, there are some in Baltimore as well that I had to look in uh, microfilm versions, and that's a very different way of reading, and it allows you to avoid some of the contextual problems that Joe points out, which is that when we dip into a source where a particular newspaper article, we're removing it from its larger context and conversation. And it's often very difficult to sort of excavate the context for something when we're going about it from, a keyword search perspective. I can tell you that the number of times when I tried to find where something was taken from, because a lot of my research had to do with reprinting networks. The number of times I tried to pull together that context and just wasn't able to was incredibly frustrating. And it's something that uh, may have been easier uh, in a slightly less ambitious, but ultimately in a lot of ways beneficial process of going a bit more slowly, sitting in the American Antiquarian Society and paging through a pile of Massachusetts spies, right? Not that they be in a pile, but so I think when we think about the utility of these digital tools. And as Nora threatened, especially when we come to talk about LLMs, the efficiency is very attractive. It allows us to do things that weren't possible in the 1960s. It allows us to ask questions that we couldn't have asked even just a few decades before. But it also carries enormous risks that I think are familiar to practitioners of the digital humanities and many of the people in this room.
Can I take one more little bite at the apple to pick up on something that Jordan just said? In terms of thinking of one of the things that you lost, and every time I have this kind of conversation, I write Laura Putnam's name down, who wrote a fantastic article 9 years ago in the American
Yeah.
Historical Review about exactly this issue of the way
Yes.
in which digital research changes, and addresses it in it's not bad, it's different, and there's things we gain and things we lose. But exactly that thing is one of the things you lose is that these paragraphs that both Jordan and I were plucking it out and looking at reprintings are in the context of a whole load of stuff in a single issue of a newspaper that you really get a sense for. Thanks, Jessica, for that link. Um, that you really get a sense for sort of a community when you're thinking about, this piece about the Stamp Act, this piece about the Alienist Edition Acts is right next to an ad for a runaway slave, right? Which Jordan, you wrote a fantastic article tracing, um, or an estate sale, or ships coming in, right? Like it's by looking at the whole page, and it clicked that it actually, in a strange way, is another similar. That way of doing research is a similarity to the way that we read the news now. Um, when I'm in the classroom, I am usually the only person who's read a physical newspaper at this point. And so that right, and I'm guessing that most people on this webinar read news online the same way I do, which is you see a link and you click directly to that story. I don't think there's a whole lot of people, there's certainly not a culture of reading that says, I'm going to go to foxnews.com or wallstreetjournal.com or newyorktimes.com or the apps, right, whatever, and just read through and see all of the stories. Like you go from some external context to an individual story that's not in the context of um, all sorts of other things that may be going on that same day. And so there's sort of a disjuncture in the way that we're doing that research is replicating our reading practices onto an 18th century that wouldn't have read that way.
Yeah, there's something also to be said about the way that these um, 18th century practices of assembling the newspaper are not a million miles away from this kind of algorithmic curation that we associate with more with digital technology and social media. The algorithmic curation that drives Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever uh, um, is automated, I suppose, but not neutral. And in the same way, many newspaper printers are exercising a process of selection and curation that is not automated, but is also not neutral, and which often is sort of plucking things and putting them in a new context in ways that can be very confusing, can be also very generative, and result, as Joe says, in unexpected contexts.
So if I'm also understanding correctly, we're basically saying same but different, right? That
Sure.
that sort of the way people read and process news and other information in the print sphere of the 18th century is not maybe as dissimilar. It's in other words, it's similar, right? You're maybe going to the piece of the newspaper that you want to look at, and that's what you're engaging with more deeply in the way that Joe is describing how you click from one to another to another. And yet, to Jordan's point, right, that was also curated too, right? You might be seeing the full page, but the full page was still a deliberate act of organizing different content into one space. So that point about things not being neutral, and I know we are just about ready to open up to Q&A, so I will just sort of wrap up on this question. Then if we have time in Q&A, we'll pivot us to sort of the AI specter. But how does digital humanities, in sort of in brief, help us to better understand both the connections and changes between media use of the revolutionary period and media use today? Like, are there particular tools? We've mentioned databases, right? But are there other tools, programs, or methods that you think are particularly useful for understanding, again, both the connections between the media history of the revolution and our present day, but also how they are different?
Challenges. A lot of the research tools and techniques that we've used over the years to understand newspapers are they feel a bit out of date. because we have new tools seemingly every day, certainly today. We can make that comment. But I think if you'd ask me that question a few years ago, I would be, I don't know, I'd probably be eager to make a version of the same point I've already made, right? Which is that these digital tools are great for knitting together a fragmented archive. They can help you ask questions that couldn't have been asked, but as we do so, we have to just sort of build processes of contextualization into not only the research but the analysis portion of our work. Yeah, I mean, I think, Joe cites the Laura Putnam piece, and the takeaway from that, one of the takeaways from that is just the point that is so obvious to those of us who have done research in newspaper databases, which is that it's incredibly easy to cherry pick examples. And it's incredibly hard once you've found an example that's compelling to figure out how representative it is. And um, and sometimes it can be hard not to emphasize the importance of a single example that's kind of plucked out of nowhere, right? So maybe that's a bit too pessimistic for GPT-5 day, but that's sort of still where I am.
But that lets me be hopeful, which is the reminder that
You're not accustomed to that.
well, last time I was the non-hopeful person. But for both Jordan and me, our work is not possible without these digital databases and the way of thinking about the approach and the methodology of finding these kinds of connections. I mean, as I try and think about sort of like the older scholarship that Jordan and I are responding to, and that we each read. Jordan's a little younger than me, so in terms of when he was doing his comps reading, but people, when they thought about newspapers in early America, they would take an event, or they would take a single newspaper and read it through right? They would do that. They would go into the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, or the Library Company, or the South Carolina Historical Society. Um, and read through an issue, right, issue by issue of an individual newspaper. And we were able to write, each of us, a book that covers 30, 40, 50 years of time, and thinks about sort of these longer, different ranges. So it really has changed the sort of methods and methodologies um, that of the ways we can approach things. Jordan, I'm not sure if I went out or you went out, but I saw you just pop back in. Okay. I was very complimentary.
Sorry, I missed that.
That's okay. So having things, and a lot of it is, I don't think there's one tool. And as Jordan was talking, I was having nightmare flashbacks to the panoply of inchoate development tools in the mid 2000s when I started my graduate work. Piling FileMaker databases on top of Excel spreadsheets and very early versions of ArcGIS. But there's ways of showing, of both doing the research and then of showing it and animating it. And I think that leads to things. So Emily Sneff's book about the Declaration of Independence and the ways in which the news of the Declaration spread, that's due out early next year in time for the 250th, is going to be, and from the work that she's already produced, you could do a lot to show people in really granular detail in a way that was very difficult pre-2000, exactly how and where things spread over time, exactly how these conversations were developing. So I'll give it a hopeful note and then turn it over to everyone for questions.
So I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A. I don't see anything yet, so maybe folks just need another moment or two to gather their thoughts. But I will take that time then, and until we see some questions pop up in the chat. To introduce AI into the conversation, if we're talking about essentially the both the value of comparison between 18th century media and today, what that helps us to understand. If we're talking about hesitation between overly overstating those comparisons, right? Being mindful that there are still distinctions between the 18th century and our present day, the uniqueness of both the technology of then and the technology of now, right? Where does AI fit into that conversation in so many words? And for anyone who is going to check out the volume, and I really hope that you do, AI is not a very big theme in revolutions in the digital age, and part of that has to do with the timing of when the book came out. But AI is, of course, not a new technology. LLMs, more specifically, large language models, are not new. In fact, they've been around for quite some time. It was just not necessarily a, oh, sure, a request to clarify between generative and analytical AIs. Yes, thank you, Megan. That's a great point. So generative AI more specifically, where LLMs are a part or large language models are a part, was not a thread that came up in the volume simply because our contributors, of the people who contributed to the volume, that was not a tool that people were using in their digital humanities and early American historical research on the topic. So we did not deliberately leave it out or anything like that. It just was not what our wonderful experts were talking about. So being that both Joe and Jordan are not necessarily people who work with generative AI specifically, what are your thoughts about its potential promises and perhaps even more so its pitfalls of using generative AI as a tool to better understand the media history of the American Revolution?
Yeah, I think that some of the questions that we've sort of raised already are relevant here. Do digital tools just allow us to sort of see ourselves more easily in the past? I think that that's a question that digital humanists have been asking for decades, and I think LLMs make them more urgent. There are a lot of questions, in fact, that digital humanists have been asking for a while that have become more urgent over time. Um, one of those is, does the capacity to analyze uh, larger volumes of data, of sources, mean that we can be more ambitious and experimental? So maybe I'll be the hopeful person this time, Joe, for a moment, at least I'll try. Um, Digital databases, as we've been saying, that now in some ways feel almost antediluvian, helped me pull together this large data set of newspaper citations, and in the ways that and that was a data set that sort of drove the analysis of my book, and in the ways that Joe and I have been talking about, it wouldn't have been possible until relatively recently. And that took months. That took months and months of doing nothing but going through this database and trying to write down things that I found in an Excel sheet. And I've reflected on that rather bitterly in recent months, and realized if I had some of the AI tools or LLM tools that are now available to us, leaving aside issues of ethical issues, copyright issues. Nora, I'm not even going to try to touch on copyright because I would embarrass myself in front of you. But leaving those sorts of things aside, if I was able to um, harness some of these tools in the process of this research, I think it would have taken me about a week, and most of that would have been spent organizing and downloading files. So when the capacity to when the roadblocks, I think, to um, experimentation with sources are decreased, we can be more bold. We can be more ambitious in some ways. And I think the way that AI tools, LLM tools, allow us to take risks is really important. One of the big roadblocks, I think, for anyone who has moved into the world of the digital humanities at one point or another is sort of the investment of time and energy that it takes for us to familiarize ourselves with tools. I mean, this is something Joe was just alluding to, and sort of the resulting risks. Like if I invest months of my life in this project, it better bear fruit, or else I've wasted that, and I have to pivot and figure out some way I'm going to use this. Another example, I did once invest months of my life in preparing preparing a body of sources for analysis in a text analysis tool. And then, it was all ready. I pressed the button and like nothing happened because it was a bad idea, and I wasted months. And it was useful uh, to learn about that. And I now understand why that was a bad idea, why it failed. And I think today, with sort of a cooperative LLM tool, I probably would have learned that lesson in a day or something like that, right? Rather than investing quite so much time. So my point is, one of the big benefits for the use of these kinds of tools is that uh, as we're able to decrease some of the front-end investments, we can look for ways to experiment more, to see what works and what doesn't, without having to invest quite so much time and commit so much to a particular approach, a particularly computational approach, that can lead to that kind of anticlimactic conclusion of months of research. Um, let's see. I think also, related to that, we're not just talking about the use of computational tools in the style of some of the digital humanities tools that some of us may be familiar with. LLMs are also really excellent, or they're effective, I should say, at helping us visualize data and create engaging digital content that can reach people. Again, I'm bracketing some of the ethical concerns here for the moment. And I think that's more important than ever in an age when research funding is disappearing, when the humanities are fighting for their lives in a lot of ways. LLMs are arguably a force that's hastening some of those contradictions. But I think that there are opportunities that digital humanists are exploring and need to be exploring about how to use LLMs to make history more engaging, more exciting, more accessible for ordinary folks. I work for Colonial Williamsburg, and that's something we're trying to think about, and think about how to do that in a responsible and reasonable way. And it's not easy because of some of the ethical concerns that that I have set aside for the moment. But I think it's going to be one of the big questions for us as we confront the impact of these tools on our practice as historians.
I just want to draw your attention very quickly, and Joe, I don't mean to cut you off. Nell raised a great question and point in the chat, which is that printers and publishers today, they aren't the same, and what difference does that make in this conversation? So I don't know if Joe, if you want to maybe incorporate that into your response too, and Jordan, if you want to.
Am I allowed to say that I literally have a book to recommend for Nell? Yeah. Well, would you prefer that I try and say something nice about, not nice, but try and say something reflective about AI, or do the printers and publishers?
So I think really either one, and I actually think that they might be related in this sense. Like AI companies are not printers, right? If anything, their parallels maybe are a bit more to a publisher side of things than they are to the printer side of things.
Except
But
as
I
Jordan's
will
pointing
stop there and
out,
let you.
except as Jordan's pointing out, in
you-
a lot of cases, they're not even publishers, right? And and
Correct. Yeah.
Megan
Yeah.
Brett,
Yeah.
who is far more of a DH expert than I, raising the point of differentiating what we mean by AIs. Um, I think I've been trying to remind myself on my good days that there are differences, that generative AI as a tool has lots of potential to do lots of interesting things. And I think the ethical question comes in with what's in the data set, what's in that model that you're using to teach the AI. And I think we've seen some evidence that there are, I mean, Meta's, I forget which one they have that they call what they call theirs at the moment, but that they were scraping copyrighted works without permission, and that raises significant ethical questions. But if you're teaching an AI, if you're teaching a generative AI with a mod to create a model based on text that you have collected ethically, that you have rights to, that you are able to do, then that makes quite a difference. I think a lot more of the potential, and I checked on the back end with Megan about something like optical character recognition, which I is something more like an analytical kind of artificial intelligence, right? It's taking an image in a document and trying to read it and render it into so the regex databases, the images of the newspaper pages have OCR done on them, and then there's an ASCII text file sitting in the background, and that's actually what you're searching. And I would love for more work to go into those kinds of analytical AIs to be able to do that work. So the regex database is amazing in its OCR. They invested a lot. And 25 years later, they're still having trouble with the long S, which if you're not an 18th century historian, you didn't wince just now like Jordan did, right? But trying to tell the difference between an F and a long S, 25 years later, we're still having that trouble. To have a manuscript AI tool that could read manuscript and help transcribe it, is something that would be enormously transformative and helpful. The generative AI, I have more concerns about, especially because the larger companies are, and I think ethically dubious territory in terms of the ways in which they built their models. But I also see that it's 4 p.m. So Nell, I will just refer you to my book about printers when they were also editors and publishers during the Revolutionary era.
Now, I'll just say really quickly, the, I mean, Joe just described, I think, without naming, um, Notebook LM, which is Google's tool that allows you to upload files and I think in a lot of ways search through them and identify areas of potential interest, and that could kind of I think that that's particularly useful for historians in evaluating the utility of sources for their particular kinds of research questions. Um, um, so yeah, I think that that's something that all historians uh, really ought to explore because I have been, and I find it really challenging and useful. And my exploration with Notebook OM has meant that I have kind of turned around on the possibilities of AI for historical research over the past few months. So I think it's worth um, playing with and seeing what outcomes are possible for us. I'll stop talking.
And I know we're short on time, but I will give a substantive short version of an answer to Nell Painter's question, which is that I think it makes an enormous difference. So during the Revolutionary era, pre 1785, usually when we talk about a printer, that is the master printer who runs a printing office, is usually I'm going to try not to look at Jordan so he doesn't point out all the exceptions. Usually the physical printer overseeing the work of employees and apprentices, and the editor and the publisher, sometimes with backing from other people. So Isaiah Thomas, who is the founder of AAS later, talks about the Massachusetts Spy and getting support from John Hancock in the 1770s. Um, and I think that's one of the things that actually makes a huge difference now is that you've got um, mega corporations are the publishers, they're the funders, they're setting things up, and the interests of each of those three groups. Um, Although maybe printer is not the physical printer isn't as much of a factor, but now we think maybe the reporters or the journalists themselves, the editors, and the publisher um, across the media ecosystem now have different interests in terms of what they want to do, what they want to pursue. Um, and so it makes a huge difference when those are all embodied in the same person who comes from a very particular um, middling artisanal background with a particular set. And I'm answering in this vague way because it's different for each individual printer, but with a particular set of networks and connections that their interest is making sure that next week you continue to subscribe to the newspaper. Um, right. And that's suffused through that, making sure in a really small town, if you're the only newspaper, that's probably because there's not a market that can support a second newspaper. And so if you anger half of the people in your town, your newspaper's done. Right. And so that shapes the kind of interest where, NBC Universal or Murdoch or Jeff Bezos or any of the publisher, um, the financiers of media have very different kinds of interests at play, than the beat reporters who are writing about stories on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you so much, Joe. I don't know if Nora, you had a couple final thoughts before we close this out, or I can.
Yeah, well, I know we are a little bit over time, so I just want to, I think what makes this very compelling conversation, right? And I wish we had more time to chat with everyone who's here in the participants list, is that these are changing very rapidly, or in a way that I think feels very rapid to us, right? Different forms of generative AI, the legal landscape around copyright and AI, the environmental impacts, all of these conversations. But the history of digital humanities itself kind of shows us that there's often these technological transformations that can feel very, very rapid to you while you're going through it. Same thing in the printing press, across sort of, I'm thinking of Elizabeth Eisenstein's work here, right? That it feels very, very quick when you are the one living through it. And that does not imply that it's not, or that we are hallucinating the speed, because we aren't. And yet it probably also felt very, very quick to people living in the 18th century too, right? And really one of the things I love about both Jordan and Joe's work is the way that sort of time and the speed of which communication happens is a really integral part. So in the volume, what was great about being able to publish at open access, it would get to people quickly, and I hope we're able to continue to do that kind of work in the intersection of really American studies and digital humanities as things consistently shift and change, especially as we study media, which is in and of itself shifting and changing. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Nora. And if y'all will just indulge me, I know we're a little over time, but just I want to put a few thank yous out there and a few final notes as we wrap up this series. So first, I want to thank Joe and Jordan for being here today and talking about your fascinating work. I think it was such a thought-provoking way to end the conversation. And as many of us continue to reflect on what this 250th year means, I think a lot to really keep thinking and talking about. I also want to thank Nora for being here, as well as your co-editors, Mark Boonshoft and Ben Wright, who were really integral to helping us organize as well as moderate these sessions over the past 3 months, and also for pulling this volume together to give us something to talk about. And so I'll drop the link to that in the chat one more time. There are many more essays in this volume that are fascinating, and we did not have time to get to over this summer, so we really encourage you to check those out. The recordings for this session and all of our previous ones will be up on the Living Landscape Observer site soon. So please be sure to bookmark that to share with friends, colleagues, students, again, as we continue to move towards the 250th year. And we'll also send an email to everybody registered today once those recordings are up. And the last thing I want to say today before I let everyone go off to your afternoons is to please sign up for our newsletter. We'd love for you to stay in touch with the ACE Mellon Humanities Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. We have other webinars and events, as well as work from our incredible fellows to promote. And so following that link, we'll let you sign up for our mailing list, and we'll have a newsletter relaunching later this fall. So please do sign up for that. And just a big thank you again. Thank you to Perry and Eleanor, who couldn't be here, for helping me co-organize. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again sometime soon. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Jess.
Thank you all
Thank
so
you, Perry.
much.